When Yoko Ono married John Lennon in 1969, she had a child from a previous marriage. Over the course of her marriage to John, the two became embroiled in a manhunt attempting to track this child down. It seems Yoko's previous husband wanted their daughter to have nothing to do with her, and he got his wish until the child was 31. That child's name is Kyoko Chan Cox, and she's now 59. Join Factsverse as we explore how Yoko Ono's long-lost daughter has finally come forward. John Lennon wasn't Yoko's first love. In 1963, Kyoko Chan Cox was born. She was born to Yoko Ono and Tony Cox, who were two figures in the alternative culture that few people expected to procreate. By the time Yoko became romantically involved with Tony in the early 60s, she'd already been married once previously. Her first husband was Toshi Ichiyanagi. Toshi is still alive today and renowned for his contributions to the world of avant-garde music. Yoko was married to Tony Cox twice over the course of the early 1960s, though the couple wasn't able to make the relationship work. At the time, Yoko and Tony were both artists in the same counterculture scene. They did some multimedia work during their marriage, though it's undeniable their most notable collaborative effort remains their daughter. Though they tried to make the relationship work for their daughter's sake, the two found they weren't meant to be together. At first, the separation between the two artists was amicable, but this all allegedly changed once Tony realized that Yoko had found a new love interest in the form of world-famous musician John Lennon. Once Tony caught wind of John's involvement in the proceedings, he decided he no longer wanted to share custody of his and Yoko's daughter. Tony Cox didn't want John Lennon raising his daughter. After divorcing from Tony in 1969, Yoko wasted no time in marrying John the same year. Because of this, Tony took Kyoko and ran. This then resulted in Yoko and John desperately scrambling for over a decade to track the girl down, but they had no luck. When Yoko first became pregnant with Kyoko, she allegedly considered giving the child up for adoption. Yoko was said to have referred to Kyoko as a tumor during the pregnancy, showing she wasn't exactly excited about becoming a mother. Eventually, she decided she'd do her best to be there for the newborn baby. Sadly, Yoko would go on to lose the kid anyway, but in a different way. Once Yoko realized Tony Cox had disappeared with her daughter, she and John began doing everything in their power to try to track Kyoko down. The manhunt began in 1969, just after the two got married. John heard rumors that Tony had fled to live in hiding at the home of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He was the same spiritual figure the Beatles had stayed with during a trip that resulted in the creation of their most iconic popular music. How was the Maharishi involved? It seems that alternative artists ran in close-knit circles during the late 60s. As Yoko Ono's lost daughter and her father somehow ended up momentarily in the care of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But by the time John and Yoko caught wind of this fact, Tony and Kyoko were nowhere to be found. Still, John likely appreciated getting the chance to reunite with his spiritual guru. Though Kyoko and her father weren't staying with the Maharishi, Yoko and John ended up tracking the young girl and her father down at a hotel. Tony left Kyoko with a playgroup, and it was at this time that the stalking Yoko and John decided to spring into action. Yoko snuck up on the playgroup and tried to discreetly coax Kyoko away. However, Kyoko was incredibly distraught by the appearance of her mother and began crying for her father. Kyoko's cries ended up thwarting John Lennon and Yoko Ono's first attempt to kidnap Kyoko for themselves. The incident ended in Yoko and John being arrested, though John's manager was able to bribe them out of jail. From their stay behind bars, they realized they'd have to go the legal route to try to gain custody of Kyoko. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. John and Yoko moved to America to be with Kyoko. It was Yoko and John's attempts to get legal custody of Kyoko that led to the couple relocating from the UK to America. This was because Tony Cox intended to raise his and Yoko's daughter in the US. Yoko and Tony then entered into various custody battles throughout America, and this resulted in two separate state courts awarding a different of the two parties custody. According to the US Virgin Islands, Yoko deserved custody of Kyoko. According to the state of Texas, it was Tony who deserved custody. Since Tony was holding Kyoko in Houston, Texas, it ended up being the ruling of the Texas courts that proved more influential. But this didn't stop Yoko from continuing to pursue shared custody. Eventually, she managed to secure visitation rights. But Tony was too paranoid to allow the visitation to actually occur. Not wanting his daughter to spend any amount of time alone with either her mother or John Lennon, Tony refused to allow his daughter to visit. Instead, he said Yoko could only visit their daughter with the presence of Tony's own personal minister. Tony certainly had plenty of reasons to be afraid about letting Kyoko visit her mother. Yoko had tried to steal Kyoko away from him at the hotel in India, and Tony was afraid she'd try something similar. Despite the fact that Tony was justified in not wanting his daughter to visit Yoko, the court still found in the mother's favor. Tony Cox broke the law to prevent the reunion. It was determined that Tony Cox needed to allow Kyoko to visit her mother if they didn't want to face the wrath of the law. With nowhere to turn, it seemed Tony was finally going to be forced to allow the visitation to occur. But Tony surprised the world by going on the run. From this moment on, Yoko and John's hunt for Kyoko became a matter of national concern. Pictures of Kyoko were plastered all over the television, and everyone was trying desperately to track the young girl and her father down. Yoko and John used all their celebrity resources to try to track Kyoko down, but nothing worked. It seems the young girl's father had hidden her away too successfully, and Yoko was eventually forced to accept she was unlikely to ever reunite with her lost child. Yoko and John went on to have a child of their own, John Lennon, in 1975. Tragedy then struck several years later when John Lennon was assassinated in 1980. Shortly after John's passing, Yoko received a telegram that was apparently from Tony Cox. The telegram alleged that he and Kyoko were doing well, but he had no intention of ever allowing Yoko and the girl to reunite. Eventually, at age 31, Kyoko herself would make the decision to get in contact with her mother. Yoko Ono is now 89 years old, and she's never remarried. Kyoko is now 59, which means it's been well over 2 decades since the former lost child got back into contact with her mother. The two have maintained a close relationship ever since. Yoko and Kyoko have long since made contact. Though Kyoko has long since repaired her relationship with her mother, that doesn't mean she turned her back on her father. Tony Cox is still alive today and well at 85 years old. After divorcing Yoko and going on the run with Kyoko, Tony remarried and tried to give his daughter some semblance of a normal life. Tony claims he was always too afraid to willingly let his daughter reunite with Yoko, as he felt being involved with her was like touching a piece of high-voltage equipment. For her part, Kyoko understands why her father was so protective over her growing up, and she doesn't hold any grudges. Shortly before his assassination, John Lennon publicly reflected on the matter of his and Yoko's attempts to track down Kyoko and her father. Though the manhunt was technically ongoing still, both Yoko and John had made peace with the fact that they were unlikely to be reunited with Kyoko by the time of John's death. John died believing that he was the true reason Tony Cox had been so adamant about not wanting Kyoko to have anything to do with her mother. Now it's time to hear from you. Which part of the story was most surprising to hear about? Let us know in the comment section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.